I'm going to just say something to our audience, which is that we have Peter Fonagy on our channel. Anthony is one of the master clinicians who's sort of evolved and developed the practice of mentalization. In America, we don't have as many practitioners. I, as someone who had the opportunity to get treated for borderline and probably narcissism, I might be more on that spectrum, but I got DBT, mentalization, TFP, and God knows what else is mixed in, CBT. But I have found mentalization to be almost the most flexible of the modalities and the most interpersonally and intrapersonally usable and effective and also in the moment. And so this is the person that practices it and is one of its sort of founders, creators, or developers of it. So it's a total awesome gift to have you here. And I'm hoping people can learn more about it because we need it real bad, so in the world. So I think the first thing is to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. As I said, I'm Anthony Bateman. I actually trained initially at university as a vet, so that's really a long way from the mind in a sense. But I transferred to medicine and then eventually trained as a psychiatrist. Now, my interest, though, actually sort of began to focus during that training time on people who presented having tried to harm themselves or make suicide attempts and so on in the emergency departments. And that's really where I became interested in what would make people do that to themselves and so on, particularly when many of them seemed to have their life ahead, that it was quite problematic to understand, really. So that was where my interest began. But it was also around that time that I became the clinical lead, really, of a hospital unit for people with high-risk borderline functioning, narcissistic functioning, antisocial functioning, and so on. And we set up the system so it could also be research-based. And that's where I linked with Peter Fonagy at the university. So we had a clinical centre and we had an academic centre, as it were. And in the academic centre, there was a lot of work on the development of mentalizing in terms of personality functioning, and we were treating people with personality difficulties and problems and so on at the severe end of the spectrum. So that's really how it all began. And we just continued to research it, change it according to the data that we got and so on. And that's how MBT really developed.
MBT standing for?
Standing for Mentalization-Based Treatment. That's what it became.
And when you say personality functioning, can you explain what you mean by that? Maybe that's too broad a question, but...
It's kind of a broad question, but I mean, it's an interesting one because, that we're all develop traits and characteristics, don't we, over time, from both our genetic sort of complement that we're born with, as it were, and then the environmental factors that influence the expression of those genes and so on. So we build a sort of character structure and a personality structure, whether that's neuroticism, openness, agreeableness, those sorts of things, conscientiousness, these sorts of characteristics. And when those join together, they tend to form a particular way of relating to the world. So in a sense, personality and personality difficulties and disorder and so on is actually how we relate and position ourselves in the world and how the world then relates to us. And when that kind of goes wrong, it can go wrong in all sorts of ways. So in a sense, we ended up seeing mentalizing as this sort of higher order mental processing system of the individual as being core to personality functioning, i.e. how we position ourselves in our social environment.
Before we go on to what is mentalizing, I'm curious what it was that, first of all, when you were a vet, or you were training to be a vet, why you switched to people, and then also, what was it for you and about you or that interested you in psychiatry versus, I don't know, cardiology or something like that?
Well, that bit's a bit difficult, isn't it? But that second bit. The first bit's not so difficult because in a way it was people that converted me, as it were, from veterinary to medicine. It's possible that in a way I was a little bit people anxious, and therefore actually, having relationships with animals was quite soothing to me. So my sort of anxieties generally were managed and adapted, and so I was interested in them, and I still do like animals. It's one of my sort of things. I like dogs and so on and things like that. But we were training when medics and vets were trained together, and I kind of related better to the medics than I did to the vets as people in a way. So I thought, well, why am I doing this? They're doing that, and I was interested in both. It wasn't, so I kind of was influenced by other people a little bit. In a way, I continued then with my friendship group. So I think that had a strong influence.
In other words, the people that you were going to end up surrounding yourself with were the people that you felt you connected with more.
I connected with more,
and so your choice to move there
Yeah.
had everything to do with the people you wanted to put yourself around.
Yeah, to a large extent. I think, and that was when I was 20, 21. That was sort
Yeah.
of trying to operate in a way, quite naturally, as we all do, our peer group and how we relate and who we relate to, where we're comfortable and things.
Right. I mean, and that was like, in a way, a very adaptive
Yeah.
life choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not a bad choice, clearly.
Well,
but
it worked out.
It worked out.
Because I did have quite a range of interests, and one of my jobs that I did enjoy, funny enough, you just brought it up randomly, was cardiology. I enjoyed that. And then I also did quite a long period of time in neurology. But each time, at that time, I sort of thought, there's a person behind all this. We're doing all this sort of science, and I wasn't that convinced by some of the science, I should add, at the time. But, we did all sorts of things that I did wonder what the evidence was for them, and things like that. And then I really enjoyed a sort of general practice that was in the community with people, and that had some psychiatry in it. I thought, oh, this is quite nice. This is actually trying to engage in helping people in their lives and adapt, maybe to other illnesses, but also to then their mental illnesses and so on. And I just enjoyed it.
And then when you started working in psychiatry, were there as many drugs as there are today? I mean, were psychosocial interventions more the norm in those days than just drugs for psychiatry?
Well, they sort of were. And it's a great question because in the early 80s, one of the things that I thought was on the rise, as it were, was social psychiatry. The sort of, depressed mums in the community, the sort of social interventions in trauma circumstances, within the community and things. There was quite a lot. And I was really interested in that. And I thought that was the future, only to find that by the time I'd been there around for a few years, there seemed to be a whole shift to organic psychiatry or to medication and psychiatry, so biological psychiatry. And the sort of psychosocial interventional process actually got relegated to an also-ran, really, because there was a great hope that somehow this would. And to be honest, I think that great hope has been completely dashed. I never really had that hope because my interest was in this broader sort of interventional system, really, psychological, psychosocial, and so on. Although there's a place for medication, I think it got overplayed. And now we're getting back, I think, to somewhere where I hoped we would have been in the 1980s, but there we are.
Because I think mentalization is so much dependent on the collaboration that you have had with probably many people, notably Peter Fonagy.
Yeah.
Maybe you should first define mentalization.
Yeah, so you did ask me that.
And then we'll go back, because I'd be curious to understand the origins of how that definition came to evolve or materialize.
Yeah. In a way, it's not just Peter and me at all. We got our names there as well, but there's lot of other people who've been involved over time, have gone off on their own lines and so on. It's a sort of focused effort with a range of people, but around sort of mentalizing development especially, and developmental psychology by a huge number of people. The first thing in sort of defining it is to remember that it's a developmental sort of process that builds over time. So we're talking about child development here. We're talking about the context in which these capacities develop for human beings, for us. And And they develop within the context of attachment and so on. So, this was all in the context originally of attachment research and child development and so on. And mentalizing was certainly, I was miles away from it in a sense, but it was there with Peter Fonagy, Mentalization, George Gegg, and many other people as a sort of developmental process of significance that seemed to lead through, along with other sort of processes, to personality problems or to behavioral disturbance and so on later on in life, as it were. So we were just interested in this process, which was called mentalizing. And that term was already in the literature. It's been in the literature. We just pulled it out and redefined it more carefully. So it was no longer just used either in a psychoanalytic specific way or in a sort of cognitive form of theory of mind and so on. It was actually a mental process within a wide aspects of human functioning, mental function. So it became defined as actually the ability that we have to actually consider that through behaviors and so on, that there are mental states behind that. So we can consider our own mind states and those of others and actually explain to ourselves, as it were, what makes someone behave as they do or present as they do and think as they do.
And why was that an important concept to sort of evolve so that you could work with people who you felt were struggling? Why do we care?
In a way, a hypothesis was generated, which was that, and again, we're talking about the 80s, early 90s, in which borderline personality disorder, which was much better defined as this sort of confluence of relationship problems, instability about one's own self-experience, and those sorts of things, along with some impulsivity and inability to control emotional sort of processing, really, and the sort of pain that led to. Could this be actually seen as a problem of mentalizing? So that the difficulty was, as it were, within the mentalizing, that high-level mental processing system, and the fallout was, you saw the fallout of it all,
in the behaviors
everything that people
and
the
were doing.
pain that the person had, but actually the problem was somewhere else in a sense. Right? Yeah. So it's top down rather than bottom up sort of consideration, and we focused on the top part.
Can you track the developmental process of mentalizing as it begins in infancy, or giving us a little taste of what it is? And well, go ahead. I'm not going to.
Okay, I'll try and give you a little précis maybe. But this is obviously this sort of development of mentalizing in a way over time. You're asking about.
Yeah.
So developmentally, in a way, mentalizing begins, of course, at a sort of zero level, if you like, and it has to be built over time. So, in a sense, we actually learn about ourselves through others. So our inner experience is transmitted to others, as it were, our caregiver, mother. Let's just take it as that prototype at the moment. And actually it's reflected back and given some sort of structure to it. And I actually take that in, and actually it begins to form a self. So the self is created, if you like, through the mind of another, in a way, originally. So that's what we call, in social mentalizing terms, I mode. But I mode is in this context of me mode, sort of how I am seen, or how I express something to someone else, and then how they see me, and so on.
Can I back?
Yeah.
So if you're talking about the self, like taking it in as a self, as in the I mode.
Yes.
So if you're a baby.
Yeah.
And you're hungry, or something hurts, you cry.
Yeah.
And then your mother holds you and does something to respond to that stimulus of cry.
Yeah.
And that over time gets big, grows so that the expressions become more representational.
Yes, you move from that sort of physical sort of soothing, as it were, to a sort of representational level of soothing in a sense. So they start building together. The example you give, and I'm crying, so I have an experience, and actually the person responds in a way that matches that need of that experience. So when it sort of maps, that's really nice, that soothes me. And that's exactly what happens in the attachment process, this physical proximity seeking, behavioral system where I have an experience which is in general fearful or make anxious, so I proximity seek, and that person responds in a certain way which actually manages my anxiety. I'm soothed, and that builds a sort of trust in that relational system.
And does it also give the person that sense of whatever's going on inside of them, this outside thing is responding to, and so they know that it's sort of real, I guess?
Absolutely. This is actually a real experience, and it has meaning, and it's communicated, and so on. So it's got a whole series of things in it. How do I learn and label something anger or hurt or upset or, pleasure, excitement? And so I do that through actually the calibration system that we're just describing. So it's incorporated, if you like, into the self. So it builds that sort of picture, that map that I have. And it also allows me to build a map of relationships, what they're like, and actually can I trust in them, and so on. If this goes well, of course, I build quite a stable mentalizing picture of myself because it's coherent, it's continuous, and it gives me prediction and expectation of what I get back and what I might get back when I express something. So, it's a good predictor. And it's kind of when I don't get back what I expect, I say, oh, hang on a minute, there's something funny going on. And so I can then reflect on that or see what it is and so on. So this is how we build what we call really an I, and it's I mode in terms of clinical practice.
And so I think also then what you're saying in terms of functioning predictively for you, for someone in a situation, is if you have an environment that responds, when you cry, you get held, versus sometimes you get held, sometimes you get yelled at or ignored.
Yes, or I get smacked and told I'm a nuisance and all sorts of things. And then my state is not taken seriously, if you see what I mean. I don't get a response that actually, as it were, joins with it in order for me to begin to be soothed. I get more sort of adverse experience. I get more anxious. And, George Geiger very creatively showed that the responsiveness in the attachment processes actually is really quite complex, that we all do it relatively naturally. That's the great thing. In a way, there has to be a matching response to the need for whatever is being expressed. So there's a sort of accuracy to it. And then the second bit was that the responder actually shows that this is the sort of mental state of the other person. It's not them. It's my baby. So they do a complex marked thing, which says, so if I can just imitate it, the baby's crying because, and you're not quite sure why, but you pick them up and go, oh, ooh, ooh. So you represent hurt or something like that, but you show that it's the baby's hurt, not your hurt.
Which is this very nuanced thing to actually do, but we just intuitively
do it. This is from your perspective. This is you, and how you're experienced now.
You.
But I'm not taken over by it, and also
right. You're not also then crying profusely and needing to be soothed.
Yeah, and once we're crying, then I need to be soothed as well, and then everyone needs to be soothed, and that's
messy.
Would generate a messy situation. Yeah.
So then the baby begins to generate this experience of their feelings or their sensate self. They'll understand the effect that feeling has when externalized on how their environment can respond to
and
it.
they begin to trust in the environment if it's a sort of secure attachment process. But then a later development occurs, of course, where they're able, because they've got the mental capacities to actually see things from someone else's perspective. So, for example, that could be just in the physical world initially. So they become aware that I can see something, but you can't, because I know there's an object in your visual field line. So I know that you can't see that, and so on. So I begin to be able to represent what you can see, or what you know, or what might be in your mind. So I can see things from other people's perspectives, both in the physical environment initially, but then in the mental environment.
I see.
Okay, so they can imagine where your mind is coming from.
Right.
Yeah, and this is building perspectives. Okay, but mental perspectives, it's not just about knowledge, it's actually about experience.
They're
and
getting
about,
inside your head.
yeah, they get inside your head. And we do it incredibly well, actually. We do it just automatically.